Hello, ladies and gents, boys and girls, people of all ages, sexualities, and identities, and welcome back to another review slash film review slash biopic. That's right, we've got a new series on the lineup. We are now going into biopics slash true stories, and today's first biopic is none other than Michael Part 1. Now, you're most probably wondering, why am I calling it Part 1? Because this film is going to be made in 2 installments. I've just finished watching the first installment, and to my knowledge, the second installment is coming out sometime next year. So, what do we learn from this first part of Michael's story? Well, we learn about him growing up in the Jackson 5. We learn about the peer pressure from their father to become the greatest selling artists of all time. We learn the constant struggles in the relationship between Michael and his father. We learn the trauma and the pretty much flashbacks of stuff that are going to haunt him for the rest of his life. And we learn about secret deals behind closed doors that may have potentially shifted the course of Michael's life. Let's start from the beginning. Michael's father gets them into the show business because he doesn't want to be going backwards in life. He doesn't want to be working in a job that he hates. He doesn't want any of that anymore. He has managed to find an opening in the door, and he is going to try and seize that moment, using his kids to do so. They begin to blow up, and Michael one day whilst coming home begins to whinge at him about the fact that they all want to go to bed. However, his father doesn't listen and of course decides, rather than to talk it out with his son, he decides to give him a beating. Michael has a constant series of these throughout the story, and as the fame begins to grow, Michael finds himself feeling like he's falling into the shadows. Michael also has a coping mechanism using his favorite childhood story of Peter Pan to explain everything that's going on in his life. For instance, Joseph, his father, is always compared to Captain Hook. As the story progresses, Michael soon finds himself in the eyes of certain producers who find him to be absolutely gobsmackingly talented. They don't know where his beautiful vocal pitch comes from, but they know that they want to harness it. That's not to say that they want to push any of the other boys out of the picture, but they definitely feel like Michael has a gift to share. However, at a very young age, his father doesn't like the idea that these producers are becoming the new father figure in Michael's life, and so he tries to push them out of the picture as much as possible. Michael also finds out at a very young age that he ends up in the company of one of the bodyguards who essentially protects the house. As Michael slowly but surely gets older, he eventually decides to break off from the family and come up with his own record label. This naturally absolutely infuriates his father because he keeps trying to get Michael to do all the Jackson tours. As the tours go on, Michael starts his own solo label. None of his brothers are annoyed by this, but eventually Michael gets to the pushing point and he decides to hire someone to essentially sack his father. By doing this, he completely cuts ties with his father, but his father isn't happy with this. Michael gets a little bit of leeway whilst they're out on tours and such. However, he soon finds himself crossing paths with his father once again when his father decides to make a deal with none other than Don King. That's right, you heard me right. The guy who fixed a lot of boxing fights has potentially made a deal with Joseph to shift the course of Michael's life. But he's not the only challenge that Michael finds. Michael comes up with a bunch of concepts. Rather than doing too many interviews, he would rather come up with mini videos slash promotions that will essentially put his product out there on the market. One day, whilst going to a studio and asking whether they can put it on MTV, the guy at the label tells him the fact of MTV being a little bit racist against black artists, so it's going to make it much harder for him to essentially get himself on the map. However, Michael, knowing that his rise of status at this point in time, begins to push the producer to see what he can get done. They manage to settle a deal, and all of his little mini sods are aired on MTV. Michael eventually ends up going on the tour that Don King had essentially made a deal with his father for. When this happens, Michael accidentally gets caught ablaze when a light gets too hot and sets his hair alight. He falls down on the stage and his family have to take him to the hospital. Whilst at the hospital, Michael finds himself trying to care for the other people in need. He takes a big sum of money from all of the sales he's got from tickets and other vendors to essentially help out people in the hospital. Michael then eventually manages to leave the hospital and go back on stage. When he does so, he goes on a couple tours, which then he decides to drop the mic on his father once and for all, cutting ties from him completely and proving that he's his own man. The best way he manages to do this is to essentially call it out on the mic so his father has no control over the situation. He leaves with the bodyguard and decides to move on from his father's shadow. Now, a couple key points I should quickly go back on is, over the course of this story, as I previously mentioned, Michael finds himself feeling like he's falling into the shadows. One of these examples is when Michael tells his mother the fact that everyone around him seems to be more obsessed with his image than who he is as a person, and this upsets him. This is why over the course of this story we're explained that Michael seems to want to get a lot of different animals to essentially fill the void of his lack of friends. One of these well-known animals still to this day is none other than the chimp Bubbles. Now, before I get into the scoring of this film, I think this is a good point in the review to just quickly drop a couple of suggestions for other films if you really like this type of film. Now, the first one I'm going to suggest, if you're really into Michael Jackson and also into what happens behind the scenes, might I suggest This Is It, a kind of documentary slash biography film back in the day where Michael Jackson essentially takes you behind the scenes of a lot of the sets such as Thriller and Beat It and so many more to see the set being put up, see the takes that were taken, and most importantly watch the behind the scenes of the dance crews learning a lot of the moves. Now, the second film I am suggesting is none other than Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Moonwalker is a very interesting and maybe dramatized version of Michael's life. Yes, we find Michael following himself through footsteps of his past, but most importantly, we also begin to watch Michael show a kind of glimpse into the way that he sees the world. Throughout this film, we find Michael being chased down by cops, find him going down into secret laboratories, and most importantly, we find him trying to show the world through the eyes of a man who finds himself feeling like he comes from the stars. Michael tries to protect the kids in this film at all costs, and he shows that not only by the fact that he is scared for them when he goes down into the laboratory, but by the way that he turns into a giant robot. He feels like he is being pushed into a corner and he can't take it anymore. Another thing that is brought up in this film is the idea of the press and the fans being too overwhelming themselves. We find Michael being chased in one scene by a bunch of clay animations which quite clearly are supposed to be fans in Hollywood and around his neighborhood in general. He doesn't disapprove of his fans, he just feels like some people take it a little bit too far. Now back to the main biopic at hand, Michael, Part 1. What would I give this out of 10? Well, Jafar Jackson is undoubtedly and undeniably Michael Jackson in this biopic. He takes the elements, the joy, the love, and the embrace of music and dance that Michael has, and he absolutely sensationally brings it to the screen. And for that reason, I give Michael a solid 10 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next film review. Until then, stay beautiful, you beautiful people.